Hello, everybody. I am Markos Moulitsas. I am here with Kerry Eleveld. Welcome to our weekly show about politics, Daily Kos' The Brief. We are 1 week from the election, so I think it's pretty obvious what we're going to be talking about, the election. We have two great guests. We have Angelo Carusone. He is the president of Media Matters. We're going to be talking about how Fox News and that right-wing echo chamber has affected Donald Trump and his Republican Party. We're also going to be talking with Daily Kos senior political writer, Joan McCarter. She's actually, if I'm not mistaken, the original first Daily Kos staff writer other than me. We're going to be talking about the Senate and about what we might be able to do about the Supreme Court. So we have a great show ahead of us. Thank you so much again for joining us. Kerry, we are 1 week out. And there are sort of two macro trends that I think we're seeing, right? One is that Joe Biden is favored. It's not a done deal. Nobody's claiming victory yet, but it seems that he's favored and looking pretty good. And the second one is where the real battle is happening. Can we take a major, can we win the Senate in the kind of numbers that we need to enact systemic change, like expanding the court, like statehood? So what are you seeing this last week as we head into the final days of, holy crap, election 2020?
Well, I think there were a lot of Democrats who were like, when he announced that he felt good about a certain number of states, he, checked off the list a couple, and then he's like, and I'm gonna be campaigning in Georgia, and I'm gonna be campaigning in Iowa, and Democrats were like, oh my God, it's 2016 redux, like, when the Clinton campaign kind of like, left
Arizona, yeah.
They were like expanding the map to Arizona and things like that, but kind of like weren't paying too much attention to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and then whoop, there it was. But again, not 20. This is not 2016, right? We're always fighting the battles of the last war, and it's not 2016. The polling is better. They have been very attentive to their core states, as we talked about last week, even of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, to this core audience where I think Biden has a very natural fit there with voters. But of course, he's got two campaign stops in Georgia this week. He's going to do a campaign stop in Iowa. Kamala Harris is doing a campaign stop in Texas. And the thing that all of these states have in common is that they have important, but not necessarily in the bag, Senate races. So it's on the one hand, you've got two Senate races, which Civics polling just released today found, two Democrats in striking distance of not only winning, but potentially getting to the 50% threshold you have to reach in Georgia in order to, take the state outright and not do a runoff.
Yeah, Georgia has, just so people, they have two Senate races this year. They have a regular scheduled Senate race, and they have a special election as well. So given how well Biden is doing in the state, it's a narrow lead. Nobody's taking this one for granted, for sure. No. But this could be the sort of coup of the entire cycle where you can win the electoral votes, which doom Trump immediately.
If he takes Georgia,
two Senate races,
right? And potentially you get the bounce of one or two Senate races, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. But also the same thing in Iowa. If he takes Iowa, in Georgia, the aggregates show that Biden's just barely above, like not even quite a full point above where Trump is. But in Iowa, that's in Georgia. In Iowa, the aggregates show him 3 points up. Plus, you've got the Senate race there where Democrat Teresa Greenfield's trying to knock out Joni Ernst. And that seems entirely possible. So, you get the benefit. You don't get the benefit of two Senate races there, but you do get potentially a key Senate win. And they don't win without Iowa either. Iowa was in Bill Stepian's path to the Trump campaign manager's path to 270. He counted Iowa as one of the easy gets, right?
Yeah, the easy ones.
Right.
Yeah, and that Senate race is actually very important because Democrats have a solid path towards three pick a net 3 pickups, lose a seat in Alabama, but pick up seats in Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and North Carolina. That gets us to a 50-50 Senate and a tiebreaker if we win the White House. That's not going to do it, though, if we want to do the systemic change. It may be barely enough to get some of the most basic things. But really, if we're going to talk about eliminating the filibuster and expanding the Supreme Court and statehood for DC and Puerto Rico and a National Voting Rights Act, you're going to need some padding there. You're going to need some cushion. So you're really wanting to get to 53, 54, 55 Senate seats. And that requires states like the 2 seats in Georgia. It requires the Iowa seat. So it absolutely makes sense that Biden would be spending time in those states, even though I got to say, Kerry, that's where 2016 comes back and sort of bites me. Like I'm not too worried about the polling and people freaking out that the polling made him complacent in 2016. To me, it's the travel schedule. And I'm not going to say it's the most rational reaction for sure. Right. It makes sense with the data and on paper, but it still hits me a little.
He was in Pennsylvania yesterday. It's not like they've completely abandoned. So anyway, I don't know. I feel better saying that. I feel better.
Yeah. So I think this is a good time to bring our first guest on. He is Angelo Carusone. He is the president of Media Matters and an old friend, an old movement friend. Media Matters is a media watchdog organization. And I think, Angelo, first of all, thank you for joining us. So pleasure to see you.
Thanks for having me.
I think it might have been right after that last debate where Trump just said things that made no sense to anybody who wasn't sort of trapped in that Fox News echo chamber, right? And you tweeted something that Kerry and I both like immediately jumped at. And it's this idea that Trump, if he loses, it will be in no large part because of his reliance on Fox News and that sort of echo chamber. And that's really landed really well, right, Kerry?
Yeah. To me, it sort of summed up what I've been thinking. I tell you what, just before this little background that it's probably more information than you need, but just for your knowledge, Angelo, just before the debate, Axios had tweeted out something saying, look for Trump to call Biden the chairman or something like that in order to emphasize the Hunter Biden.
Something weird, yeah.
Or the chairman. And I was like, I get paid to follow the news, right? I was like, I have really no idea what this is. Of course, I know there's Hunter Biden emails going on, but what is he even talking about? So anyway, when I saw your tweet, it really summed things up for me. I ended up writing a story on it. But please weigh in. We've just been talking at you.
I know that's exactly right. I think the one thing that really just underscores how much it is an entirely parallel universe is that in the lead up to the debate, Fox News had covered the Hunter Biden story 3 times as much as they talked about anything related to COVID. That was, if you turned into Fox and you're a Fox viewer, which is Trump's world, you would think it was the most explosive story in the world. And that does cloud your ability to see the field. Because when you are just consuming that and you're not at least allowing yourself to look elsewhere, what you're left with the impression is that this is the explosive scandal of 2020. And I think it really does cloud their judgment. And I would say that, I always talk, when I talk about Roger Stone stuff, the one thing I say is Roger Stone lies to everybody else but himself. And, he's always honest about the field to himself, because obviously he knows sometimes when he needs to cheat and lie. And it's important to have that perspective. That's fundamentally the problem with only getting your worldview through Fox. And it really was clear after that, especially with the bizarre references, as if everybody was following it as closely as he was, that it wasn't going to penetrate because it hadn't been echoed in the rest of the media landscape.
Right. Just playing off of that, I wonder, because I feel like there was a point somewhere during Trump's presidency where I feel like Republicans used to go on Fox and realize that it was a different ecosphere, right? That's when you were in that environment, you said certain things, you did certain things to sort of rile up the base, but you needed voters outside of that environment to buy into what you were saying. So you had other avenues that you would reach them. I feel like at some point in Trump's presidency, even Republican lawmakers started to buy into this is just, this is all we need. This is all we're going for. And we believe, our own sort of BS about where we are with voters and all this stuff. And now I think they're actually seeing, their internal polling and realizing, oh, we're actually in a lot of trouble. But do you think, have you noticed a similar shift? And at what point might it have happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the moment, it's funny that you make that observation because, part of the tweet that I even talked about in that tweet was also as much about the current political climate as it was about how Trump had sort of internalized a lot of Fox's coverage related to COVID and coronavirus. So many of the big moments where he was out of step was because he was responding to things that Fox was saying. The cure is here, downplaying the virus, hydroxychloroquine's amazing. And to your question specifically, I feel like that it actually happened last year at some point, maybe even before then, but it actually didn't really think about it until maybe 2 weeks into the pandemic when the lieutenant governor of Texas was on Fox News and had said that old people should be willing to die in order to keep the economy going. This is back in March when everybody was fully locked down and scared. And the response to it was fierce. I mean, it was really intense. But what was amazing about that was that even though it got such initial backlash, that became the default Republican position not that soon after. So the thing that the lieutenant governor of Texas said that got widespread condemnation was the default in just a couple of weeks. And I think that for me was clear that Republicans as a whole sort of stopped being in on or sort of lost sight of the idea that Fox was only a small sliver of the rest of the landscape and that it wasn't entirely reflective of reality, that instead of it being a political tool, it's sort of like, when bad consultants rely just too heavily on bad polling to sort of convince the people that they're that they're working for to keep paying them to do these strategies. It's like that. It's like they just kept buying into that worldview, even though, And I think that was the moment for me that made it clear that if they were looking at the field, they would have taken away a different outcome from that.
Is there a sense that Fox News is even more dangerous for somebody like like Donald Trump and the Republicans, given that the broader media might have learned the lessons from 2016? I mean, if nobody else is covering the Hunter Biden story, and Fox News is the only place covering the Hunter Biden story, does that create even more of a lopsided incentive to sort of, cocoon yourself into that warm, conservative, safe space that Fox News provides?
Yes, and there's two big things related to that. One is that the further isolated the Fox narrative gets from the rest of the media ecosystem, the more toxic it becomes. So it actually the threshold required editorially to overcome it, to start to talk about it, like unless it's worked in the initial burst of the story, the more it just becomes a Fox universe or a Murdoch story, the harder it would be to get other papers, even sort of like, mid-size and local papers, to write about it, because the editorial threshold goes up. The perception is that, well, if it's just exclusive to their province, it's not going to be enough. And so one, in a way, they toxify a story by simply owning it. And that's one piece.
Interesting.
And then, the second thing is that every major moment, or almost every major moment that has radically distorted or was been a piece of disinformation, ultimately has gone through the Fox cycle, where Fox goes in on it every hour on the hour. Then the next day or 2 days later, they then attack all their media competitors for ignoring the story, which in turn gets them to write about it or to talk about it. And then ultimately the original story is later disproven or shown that it's bogus, but it doesn't land, right? Yeah. But no, the damage is done. That just hasn't played out here. And it's not just been the Hunter Biden story, it's been throughout this cycle. In a way, that Fox tool just isn't as effective anymore as it was in the past. And it's in large part because, the media, the rest of the news media, and I'm always down to criticize them, and there are plenty of things to criticize them for, but they've definitely built up a little bit of some antibodies, at least as it relates to sort of the Fox virus.
I think that rings true with me. I was part of the Washington media, and I would just say that, it does seem like, even though the media is never going to be as good as liberals want the media to be, because they always seem to do this both sides thing and whatever. It does seem that they took away from 2016 being sort of like used as a little bit of a tool. And then you see how that plays out after, let's give Democrats some credit. House Democrats with very little backing behind them in many ways, impeach Trump for exactly what Trump has spent the last month or 2 months trying to do with his buddy Rudy Giuliani and with these Hunter Biden emails and whatever. And, by House Democrats actually impeaching him for that, they kind of gave up the game. It was they put it all out there for voters to see. And I think it got less traction. They also spent time letting people know that, for instance, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin was going to do this report that was coming out, and that it was fueled basically by a Russian intelligence officer. So
That's right.
Democrats did do a job in terms of saying, we're not just going to sit back like we did in 2016 and let McConnell dictate how we handle this. We're going to get it out in the open ahead of time. So we, suddenly this just, voters have no idea,
It's true. There has been a shift in that orientation, at least with respect to the press, and that it's a different kind of engagement that was a little bit lacking. It's not that you have to necessarily always be hostile and adversarial, but there was a little bit of a spine stiffening on the part of Democrats that relied on some more transactional information, which is like, hey, this is what disinformation is, and you can't become an unwitting agent of that to destroy our country. The other thing, and I think we kind of, in a weird way, the larger circumstances helped underscore and reinforce that critique too that Democrats and others were making, which is that the coronavirus coverage and how the administration responded, it's a very personal thing. No one's immune from it. The richest people, elite,
right.
It doesn't make a difference. Journalists, nobody is immune. They're all affected by those bad policies and the lies. They can see the lies and feel them in such a palpable way. And then, one of the things that really did, I think, help us get to this moment as well is, during all of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the incredible administration response, the way that journalists were attacked, it's not that it radicalized them, but I also think what it did is it reinforced for them what's at stake, that it's not all academic and that you can't false equivalence everything, that at some point, Margaret Sullivan used to say that there's an obligation for journalists to be truth vigilantes. And in a way, that was her big thing when she was at the Times, was to constantly say that that's what reporters need to be. And I really love that expression because I feel like that's essentially what people want from reporters. They don't want necessarily a bias or an opinion, but they want people to help them understand, to use their professional tools to explain. And that kind of got lost in a lot of our reporting. And I think what you've seen recently, and it's reflected in the editorial decisions as much as it's in how they write it, it's that they are going to some extent just ignore BS when it's very obviously and transparently what it is. Obviously, Rudy Giuliani is like a gigantic BS alarm, so that helps whenever he's near a story. But there are indicators here, but certainly there's been a big shift in the press. How long that lasts, who knows? But it certainly is felt.
Let me bring in an audience question real quick, because we have a good one that I think is very relevant to you, Angelo, and it's from Eric. It's a Facebook. He's a Facebook user, and says, "What would be the best way for the Biden-Harris team to preemptively counteract Trump's sort of inevitable attempt to prematurely declare victory on election night?" Since you traffic in disinformation basically all the time. What do you have to say about that? Democrats, Biden-Harris ticket.
So we've actually done focus groups on this, which we've never done before, precisely because this is a disinformation problem. And there are two things that really stood out from all of it. One is that we should not underestimate the power. If Fox News cost Donald Trump the election, Sinclair Broadcasting is going to be the thing that helps him survive if it's a fight after the election, because they're a local network. Insidious. They own so many stations across the country. So far, every single attack on the voting fraud that has turned out to be bogus, that has penetrated the national conversation, was amplified by a local Sinclair station first, and then worked its way up the chain. Most people don't realize what a Sinclair station is. So,
just to be clear, they own like hundreds. I'm not sure. It's like 200 plus or something.
It's a lot. Yeah.
Across the country. Right. And so when local, people in wherever are watching that station, they kind of feel like, oh, it's my local station. Like they're not going to lie to me. So, but it's Sinclair Broadcasting. Sorry, go ahead. Please.
No, that's it. That's exactly right. They are everywhere. In some places, they own 2 of the local stations, which is really scary. And they, one would be for them to start to do just a little bit of prep work on that, because that inoculation goes a long way to not lose sight of it and to talk a little bit about if you're going to see the stuff bubble up from the top, that's going to affect people's perception. It's actually people trust their local media when it comes to results more than they trust national, which is incredible, but true. And it makes sense. And the second thing is that there's a little bit of information goes a long way. In all the studies that we did, most people didn't know 2 really important facts. They didn't understand truly that you're not allowed to count the votes in most places until election day. And if you tell people that basic information, the assumption on the front end is, well, if they don't have the results, something sketchy is going on, right? When you tell people, by the way, they're not allowed to open the votes, they'll acknowledge that the law is stupid, but at least they won't think that it's a scheme. And then the second piece of information relevant to that is most people don't know that there are election judges for votes that are counted remotely. And if you tell people, even Trump supporters, not all of them, but a large number of them responded very positively to the idea that if there's election judges in the room, the outcome is much more dependable and reliable. And just those 2 pieces goes a long way. So I think that it's important for them to spend a little bit of time beginning to condition people and socialize people to the red mirage, this idea that Trump might be ahead.
Yeah, who's them?
Oh, sorry, the Biden-Harris leading Democrats. To the questioner's point, I mean, it shouldn't be the thrust of their campaign, but that's what these surrogate operations are for, the messaging operations. Everything shows that the best way to deal with this is actually, to what the questioner had asked, preemptively counteract. Being responsive on this is actually an uphill fight, but there's a lot of potential on the front end that makes it a lot harder for chaos or confusion strategy to be employed. And that's obviously the big fight after the election.
Do we know right now what network policy is going to be about declaring victory, either Biden or Trump? And because one of the fears and one of the things that Trump is clearly banking on is the idea he'll win day of votes, can declare victory that evening, and then that sort of frames any legal battle in the subsequent days and weeks over counting any mail and early votes. What do we know that the networks are going to be doing to maybe help mitigate this risk? I mean, they're
trying to affect their calling models a little bit to adjust. So typically, most networks will have their own, their own election team that makes these calls. Some work in conjunction with the wire services like Reuters. So for example, most of the social Facebook is like partnering with Reuters, for example. So they're going to rely on their calls. The one though that I think sticks out that's unique and distinguishable from previous years is that there's a special service that the AP provides where it's beyond just as a part of their election intelligence, where they do hundreds of thousands of phone calls. Think of it like exit polls, but on steroids. They're just going to be, it's all kinds of post-electoral voting. So it's the idea is that it's going to improve your model so that you can then make perhaps your predictions a little bit earlier because you'll have more information to do a formula on. Fox News is the only channel, the only network, and the only outlet that purchased AP's unique data set, which is going to give them the capacity potentially to make calculations and try to get preemptive calls. And that doesn't mean that they have an objective there, but it is a unique piece of intelligence that they're going to rely on that's different from all previous election cycles that I would just put out there. So the rest is that they haven't fundamentally changed how they're going to deal with calls. They're obviously going to treat, calls. They have not adjusted their headline standards yet for, we're not going to amplify a lie in a headline. So if a candidate says they win, hopefully they don't put that in there. Right. And then the third piece is, this open question about what does this mean for this larger intelligence set that actually hasn't been a part of any of our electoral coverage yet that's actually floating out there. It's a fascinating new twist.
There's going to be, I think you're right. On election night, particularly, you're going to have the surrogates filling in hours and hours of just dead space, right? I don't think people realize how boring election day is for election observers because there's nothing happening. And so you're sort of flooded with either anecdotal evidence of long lines, and everybody thinks, we're doing great because somebody took a picture of a long line. or exit polling leaks, which are almost always BS, and because they're for a lot of reasons, but they're not meant to be released in the middle of the day. So I think that presents an opportunity, Angela, like you were saying, for our surrogates, for the Biden-Harris surrogates, to use that opportunity to talk about the counting of those votes in critical states, and particularly Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which is our sort of the linchpin states that are going to decide this thing in the end, and where Trump is putting in his final eggs, I think, and where they had the most ability to create post-election havoc. So it's an interesting point that you make, and hopefully those surrogates are getting that message to really reinforce that on election day, because there's really not much happening. That's a perfect time to send that message.
It's true. I think that's a very important part of this, is that, you know, they are going to have a lot of dead space. So instead of speculating, what they could be doing is sort of beefing up as much of the, and sort of strengthening any of the resistance to the idea of chaos, which is ultimately going to be the strategy. I mean, if they're going to win, the Trump people are going to win by cheating. It's going to start with of an avalanche of lies, misinformation, and confusion, which then will stir people up. And I think the most important thing that people could do then is to give people some basic information about how the votes are counted.
Sorry, do you get the sense that the networks are prepared for something like this? I mean, no. Because they're, everybody's. I'm just thinking about Markos saying it's such a boring day, and then you fill all this dead space. And I remember in 2016, oh, we're not going to have a winner. Oh, and it just took time, and and then things changed, and it just, I feel like I just wonder, is the system set up in such a way that it's kind of, I don't want to, I'm not looking for catastrophe, and it's very possible that Biden could do so well that we avoid this all. But there is this possibility, and I just wonder, your views on where the networks are with dealing with this dead space and not necessarily needing to call an election on election night.
I think that's a good question, because I don't think they've really thought. I know they've thought through it. I just don't think they're fully prepared for this reality yet. And I worry that, I feel like there's been a good push on understanding extremism and disinformation more. I think the downside of that is I don't want them to fill their dead space with every, absurd thing that some QAnon person with 3 followers is saying on their Twitter feed, because that's not a good scenario either. Or, the sort of militia wannabe person that threatens to go out there. These are important things that need to be tracked, but they don't need to be a part of our national or election conversation necessarily. And I do think that I worry a little bit about, because it's attention grabbing, that it's going to end up being a disproportionate part of our coverage, which in turn could distort how people think about voting and potentially even have a suppressive effect if it's not handled well. And then as a whole, I do worry that there's not enough full yet. I mean, we've seen it play out in this coverage where, there have been reports about, somebody accidentally getting 2 ballots because somebody, the law requires you to mail them, to manually label them, and one poor person spilled his coffee on a batch of labels and left the labels to the side and then sent out a brand new batch. Somebody comes in the next day and relabels them thinking that they hadn't gone out yet, and 2 people get 2 ballots. That's not voter fraud. You can only have 1 ballot. They all have the same number on them, right? So they have unique identifiers, yet that was treated in Virginia, for example, as a major story because some guy spilled his coffee. That's not voter fraud, right? But it does fill a gap. And I worry about if that's filling a gap now. I haven't seen enough evidence yet that there's clarity on how they're going to fill the coverage outside of that, beyond speculation, and then beyond potentially elevating a lot of nonsense. And that's going to be hopefully something that they're pushing on over the next week. But it's still, there's uncertainty. I think, I feel it more than I have in the past, that journalists are scared and uncomfortable too. Serious reporters talking about militias and international, interdimensional demons. It's like, how is this my job now? They're uncertain, and I feel it when I talk to them. It does feel like, and I try not to lose sight of that. Usually, it's easier to be upset with them But now I also feel like they're a little lost too.
I'm realizing too, I just was remembering, the trial run for this. I was thinking 2016, but it was really the Iowa Democratic Iowa caucus where, right, where we were all waiting for the outcome, and there was no outcome. And then anyone who was covering it, the cable news outlets and whatever, were sitting there trying to fill hours of time with no outcome whatsoever. I mean, and it was, it was kind of a disaster.
It was not confidence inspiring, and it was an honest mess. I mean, some of this stuff is messy, and what they didn't make clear enough early on was that no matter how much the tabulation was messy, it didn't matter if you had to recount it 7 times, that the votes were fine. Nobody had manipulated the vote. That wasn't clear. If you had just tuned in, and you were a first-time voter energized by Bernie, or you were somebody that was super passionate for Biden or any other, you would have thought that there was something really bad going on. And in reality, it was just a couple of goofs messing up a system, and also that the Chans had flooded. One of the things that got lost in that reporting that night is that there was an intentional disinformation operation to flood the technical support line, so that the people that were actually calling the help desk were not able to get through, because a whole bunch of people on 4chan had actually identified the number to call. So county officials were having trouble getting access to basic, how do I fix this app problem for this tool you gave me? But the votes were fine. Even if if we had to wait 10 hours, it wouldn't have made a difference, because nobody was messing with the votes. It's just the tabulation that was not obvious.
Yeah, and there wasn't a major candidate creating or adding to the chaos at that time.
Right.
Bernie wasn't.
Nope.
None of the campaigns were actually trying to create. So imagine that chaos, and then having a Donald Trump just egging it on and saying, "See, it's evidence of fraud. It's evidence of fraud." And
that's exactly right.
The nightmare scenario.
Right. That's a good point. There's a marked difference between what the Democratic candidates were trying to do in that situation and what Trump will be doing.
That's right. Nobody thought it was cheating. They were all upset about the tabulation when the dust settled, but nobody said the votes were manipulated. It's just, that's a very good point.
So, Angelo, thank you so much for joining us. That's how much time we have with you. It's a real pleasure. Hopefully we can have you back and continue to talk about this. Kerry, does that fill you with a lot of confidence heading into a week from today?
It sure as heck was interesting. I mean, there were some things that Angela pointed out that I didn't even know about, that flooding the help desk situation with 4chan. But anyway, that's kind of an aside. It doesn't necessarily fill me with confidence. I mean, to hear you talk about, I was just thinking about how the system is set up, and how, unless these networks are really, truly internally grappling with, wait a second. And the one thing that gives me maybe some hope that they are, is that we did have this happen during the Iowa Democratic Caucus. I just remember Rachel Maddow sitting there on MSNBC being like, okay, well, let's go to so-and-so, and in Des Moines, and see what they have to say. I mean, it's just like,
the good thing is that this is an election night with thousands of races on the ballot. So there's stories to tell. If Michigan hasn't finished voting for Donald Trump, that's okay. Maybe we can look at what's happening in Texas. Florida's going to count very quickly. North Carolina is going to probably count quickly. We have those senators.
There will be things to talk about,
and there's several narratives. There's obviously the presidency, but there's a race for the Senate. Will Democrats hold the House? What about those state legislatures? So there's a lot of stories to be told, that hopefully can fill a lot of that dead space in case Trump is trying to create chaos in some of these core battlegrounds.
I mean, the nation, the whole country too. I mean, I'm just talking myself out of being like worried about this, right? But it's a good time here. We're family friendly, and we leave everybody with a little bit of a high. So, let's not be too downer here. But I was thinking we did have, and it wasn't a great trial run, but we did have a trial run for this nationally in 2000, right? And it was a bad outcome, but what I'm saying is it wouldn't be the first time that the nation has had to wait for an outcome of an election, right? Now, there's a lot of shenanigans that happen between the front and the back end of that getting called. But, we can't, it wouldn't be the very first time. It wouldn't be the very first time that we've had one state where we couldn't call it. And, I'm hoping we're not going to come down to one state. I sure as heck am hoping that we're not going to come down to Florida.
It better not. No, forget it. No more. No more. Ever. So on that note, I think we can bring in our next guest, which is Joan McCarter. She is a senior political writer at Daily Kos. She is the first person I think I ever paid to write at Daily Kos. So she's like OG. She is like from the beginning, and she is an.
You're
expert
saying I'm
on
old. You're saying I'm old.
That's not it.
I was there at the beginning too, Joan. I was there too. Carrie, on the other hand, she's a spring chicken here.
She's just a kid.
Yeah, I'm a kid. I'm basically your same age, Markos, but whatever. It's okay. You can call me spring chicken.
So Joan covers the Senate for us, and I'm sure she has a lot to say about the Senate, but she also, early on in this cycle, took ownership of one story, and I'm going to give her a chance to talk about it, and that's the Senate race in Maine. And this has been your personal project from the beginning, and I'd love to hear. I'd love you to tell everybody what really about Susan Collins really, triggers you the way it does to the point where you've owned this story and you've hit it relentlessly for years now.
What about it doesn't? I mean, she just embodies the hypocrisy, but she doesn't own it. I mean, Mitch McConnell, is just going to be a troll. He revels in being a troll. He loves it. He loves standing on the floor and being a hypocrite and trolling Democrats. Collins plays this game sitting on the fence constantly, all of the time, being concerned, thinking that, well, I can have an effect here. I can at least convince my constituents that I can have an effect here by doing this concerned routine, by sitting on the fence, by not giving Mitch McConnell my vote, even though we know that she's going to end up giving Mitch McConnell her vote, or not when he tells her he doesn't need it. She's useless. I mean, she's useless.
It's become sort of a meme, this whole idea that, Susan Collins is going to be so concerned every time anything happens where Republicans sort of have egg on her face, right? She's always so concerned.
Yeah.
And you're never going to have her vote when you really need it. You're only going to have her vote when it doesn't matter. When Mitch McConnell was giving it to her, said, okay, you can go off on this one, as she did with Amy Coney Barrett. Although she did very little to help Democrats trying to slow down the process of getting Barrett onto the floor, where it really matters, where if she'd had any principle, she could have possibly done something, where she may have been able to talk to Romney or to Murkowski, who's going to be the Collins of 2022.
Right.
And we also know that when Republicans tried to eliminate the Affordable Care Act and it failed because of John McCain, she actually voted on the right side of that issue, but had Mitch McConnell known that John McCain was going to bolt on the issue and had no idea, we all know that Susan Collins would not have, she thought she had a free vote here.
Yep.
Right.
Everybody did.
And just for viewers who aren't sort of maybe as accustomed to the inside baseball, right? I mean, McConnell counts and knows how many votes he's got, and then for political purposes, he'll give one or two people, or whatever he doesn't need, that's just, extra votes. He'll give them an out so that they can vote and say, well, I tried, I took the right vote and I tried to hold them, hold Trump accountable or whatever. And but that's, and Collins is the person who is one of the GOP senators who regularly gets that out from McConnell. Hey, I don't need you on this vote. So if politically it's better for you, you can take a pass on it.
And now the whole world knows it. That's the important part. It worked before. It worked before the Trump administration. And when the outs he was giving her weren't so just obviously transparent. And when she voted for, I don't know how many of Trump's really horrible nominees, including Amy Coney Barrett, on to the appeals court position she had before she got elevated to the Supreme Court, she voted for her. She's voted for most of them.
Yeah.
So,
So,
wait,
Joan, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kerry.
can I jump in? I mean, you've been covering two of the biggest Senate stories, I mean, congressional stories for the past couple of weeks, like every in and out of them. That being the Supreme Court nomination and now confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, and then also the stimulus negotiations between Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and Nancy Pelosi, with, you know, Mitch McConnell just weighing in on the sidelines every once in a while when he feels like, you know, tinkering with something or trying to seem like they're actually doing something. So I just wondered, you know, from an electoral standpoint, do you think any of these things, you know, I mean, there is some evidence, for instance, that the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in 2018 sort of helped polarize the electorate a little bit. It gave a boost to Senate Republicans in some of the redder states, but it also came back to bite them in the butt in these suburban districts in the House that defected and flipped a bunch of seats blue. I'm just wondering, do you think that any of this is really impacting the vote at this point, or voters at this point? Although financially it clearly is, but do you think it's like, is it seeping into the electorate, the stimulus? These are the two biggest stories in Congress right now. I just wonder.
I think the Barrett story, not as much, because we couldn't be any more enraged on our side over the Supreme Court than we already were with Kavanaugh. I mean, that was an immediate, okay, we're on that. That's where the money came from. And I think that was the same for the red meat Republicans too. That's just a given. That's not going to really make any difference with any set of voters. Maybe would have gotten some undecideds had Senate Democrats on the Judiciary Committee been a little bit more bloodthirsty about it. Thank you, Dianne Feinstein, who made it a cakewalk for Lindsey Graham, essentially, and for Amy Coney Barrett. But, you know, that aside,
literally hugged them.
Literally hugged them. Talked
them.
about how wonderful this hearing was. What a great example of Senate Judiciary work these sets of hearings were. When Amy Coney Barrett sat there with a blank piece of paper, holding up a blank piece of paper, saying, "This is who I am," you know, blank slate for Republicans to do whatever they want with. But anyway, on the stimulus, I do think that's more impactful because I think people are frightened. They're desperate. They're struggling. They don't have rent money. They're going hungry. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal. And I don't know that they're necessarily blaming Mitch McConnell to the extent that they need to be. I mean, you can see that Pelosi has been working really hard, but I don't know that that story has necessarily broken out of sort of congressional beltway media. And that's hard. That's tough.
So, John, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of math here.
Oh, no.
Simple math.
Simple math.
Don't worry too much. My sort of obsession, I literally woke up at 3:00 this morning, pissed off about Barrett and going like, we got to expand that court. Like that was the thing that woke me up at 3 a.m. So it's to my very core. I want to see the court expanded. I want to see statehood for DC and Puerto Rico. I want to see some kind of national voting standards passed so we don't have to win by 10 points in order to have a not contested election. And we know that a 50-50 Senate's probably not going to do it. I don't know if a 51-49 Senate does it. Do you have any sense how much padding we need so that we can suffer those defections from the Joe Manchins and the Kristen Sinemas and potentially Hickenlooper from Colorado?
Yeah.
These sort of moderate and traditionalist as well. Some of these guys are going to be like, we don't want to mess with the traditions of the Senate, right? The Leahys and the Coons. So you have these Democrats that even if they may be liberal, they just want to rock the boat. So we need some kind of padding. And just like we talked about, Mitch McConnell would give Susan Collins sort of free votes. Like we need to be able to give some of these people that free vote. Any idea how big our majority needs to be able to enact that kind of aggressive and systemic change?
If we have Kamala Harris as the vice president for one vote where we need her, I'd like 53. 55 would be Amazing. I think we might be able to squeak through with 53.
53. Now here it's only votes in the tie vote, right? So
Right,
it actually
right.
we need
Right.
so, and we could get those in the 2 Senate seats in Georgia and Iowa, plus the safer seats in Colorado, Arizona, Maine, and North Carolina. That gets us to 53. And then we still have some of the more long shot opportunities in Montana, Texas, Kansas, South Carolina. So there are some opportunities, but I've been telling everybody who will listen that we are on we're 2 points away from a good night, which would be 50 to 53 seats, and phenomenal night, which would be 55, even 56 seats.
Yeah.
So there's this notion that maybe we're going to get complacent because Biden is looking okay.
No.
It's utter nonsense, because we are really so close to breaking this thing wide open, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And we have to have enough who are going to be willing to get rid of the filibuster immediately.
Yeah.
What I would like to see, and I think the thing that could, a lot of people.
We needed 51 votes for that, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I know that
51 for that, and we've got Manchin, Sinema, Leahy.
So you think
it'll probably happen?
There's about 3 Democrats who might not be up for it.
It could be as many as 6 or 10.
Yeah.
But when it comes right down to it, I think it's probably closer to 2 or 3.
Yeah. Are these people that would buck Biden?
My dream is, in one of the best ways I think that we overcome it, is using COVID stimulus. I think the House comes in first week of January, passes a $10 trillion bill, $7 trillion. I'd like 10. I think that's what's needed. Sends it to the Senate. Senate passes it, have it ready. But the Senate's not going to pass it with Republicans. Mitch McConnell is not going to be gone. It would take a miracle. And they will filibuster it. So break the filibuster on the absolutely necessary relief to the American people. I think that's the most compelling bill we have to get that done fast.
That's really smart. I like that a lot.
Is there any reason that we can't have this ready? Not we, Democrats, we're not in the Senate, that they can't have this ready to go literally on day one? They walk in, the House passes it.
Have it ready on day one of Biden's. But yeah, they could. I mean, part of it depends, and this is one of the things that I'm really have been scared about now for a month, is that government funding runs out on December 15th from the continuing resolution that they did at the end of September.
Oh, right.
So if Trump's fighting, we just don't know. We just don't know.
Even if he's not fighting,
going to be very busy trying to get government funding done. It's possible if he doesn't fight, if this goes through, if he accepts, if he leaves.
I mean, we talk about Donald Trump. This is actually a fun thought experiment. We talk about Donald Trump fighting and creating chaos and havoc. What happens to the Donald Trump who has accepted defeat because he's been blown out of the water? Everybody's sort of walked away, and he's just sitting there lonely, a loser in the White House,
tweeting,
and he still has to sit there November, December, a little bit over.
I think he leaves. I don't think he does it.
Yeah,
I think he leaves.
He's already, if he can't create a bunch of havoc and try to suggest that somehow he can squeak in and steal the election, right? Mm-hmm. Then he's already lost all his juice on Capitol Hill. He doesn't have any juice there. He can't.
And that will be really interesting to see what the Senate does. A lame duck Senate. The first thing McConnell has already set up after the election is more judicial nominations,
right?
More confirmation votes. Which, and I want to put in here, while we're talking about expanding the Senate, or the courts rather, the Supreme Court, we have to look at all of the federal courts because they are so trumped up right now.
Now, in an interesting point, is the Senate coming in? They can come into session immediately after the election. Is there anything stopping them, or because you're going to have
scheduled now on the 9th? They could come in right away if they need to, but right now they've scheduled on the 9th.
Because Mark Kelly, if he wins in Arizona, the Democratic nominee, that's a special election. He would be seated immediately. We also have a special election in Georgia, which is a lot tougher to get the 50%. It's almost unreasonably to even hope for it, but there is an outside chance that may happen. And so there is a theoretical world where Republicans only have a 2-seat majority at that point, 51-49.
I think Kelly can't come in before something like November 29th.
That's what it's a certification of the vote. And in Georgia, presumably would be something similar. So
Something
I guess
similar,
it does still give.
So, it's going to be, if McConnell's trying to ram through horrible stuff, it's going to be up to Democrats to not play, to not allow it. And as we've seen, there's not a lot of tools that they have to do that. But at the same time, if there's a wipeout of Republican senators, do they want to leave on that note? Do they want to just burn everything down and salt the earth behind them?
I think McConnell
or
does.
do they think about what their futures are going to be, and do they play a little nicer? Because
what I don't understand is why they would push for the 6-3 majority, knowing that they were just adding fuel to the fire for court expansion, which was already discussed, but nobody was taking it seriously. You and me, Joan, we were talking about this, Kerry. Nobody else took it seriously, right? A couple of people, Brian Mullen was talking about it.
It was amazing how it went from this peripheral, only the crazy left wingers are talking about this to
Angus King.
Angus King. As Joan and I blurt out in stereo. Angus King.
Let me bring in a question, a viewer question from Peter on Facebook, and this could go to either one of you, but I think Markos probably might have a thought about this. And he says instead of expanding the court, do you feel recalculating congressional districts and statehood for DC and territories is a better means to enact change?
I mean, if we don't have the Supreme Court, we could try to grant statehood for DC, and the 6-3 Supreme Court will almost guarantee shoot it down. Mm-hmm. The idea of statehood is actually very constitutional, but we cannot trust this court to do anything. Literally nothing will happen with this court. Mm-hmm. Everything is dead on arrival. $10 trillion stimulus, dead on arrival. This court will invalidate it. And it boggles my mind again that Republicans didn't realize that a guaranteed 5-4 Supreme Court majority was better than to give liberals the ammunition they were desperately seeking to expand all the courts, all of them.
They're playing the short game. They're playing the 2020 election game.
Not just a short game, but
you've got John Roberts,
McConnell was
Brett
taunting
Kavanaugh.
us.
Oh yeah, you've got Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts and now Amy Coney Barrett, who were all on the Bush legal team in Florida in 2000.
Yeah,
don't think that they weren't considering that, and don't think that they weren't thinking that they bring suit against Wisconsin, they bring suit against Pennsylvania, they bring suit against Florida, any state they can. They get it to the Supreme Court through their Trumpy lower courts, and they make the arguments. And Kavanaugh made the argument yesterday in Wisconsin. So
I think what's interesting is that McConnell may have underestimated what kind of passion there would be for court reform among Democrats more broadly, not just liberal activists, but left wingers or whatever you want to call us. I don't know. Do we qualify? Maybe. In some people's book we do. In some people's book we don't. But in any case, I think McConnell is, I think, astute at looking at the numbers for elections, right? He's not a very good legislator. In other words, he isn't good. I mean, Nancy Pelosi is really good at looking at public opinion, knowing what she can get done by corralling a bunch of her people on all ends of the spectrum to rally behind something. She's pretty much masterful at that. I mean, McConnell's masterful at abusing power, but I don't think I think he underestimated what it would be like. He thinks he made the long play, right? He's casting this as we've got a 6-3 majority. This is the long game because now we have locked in this conservative majority.
The culmination of 40 years.
Right. I know, but I think he underestimated what kind of fuel that would pour on the fire to get sort of broad consideration by Democrats writ large on actually reforming the court. I think he miscalculated.
He's done that a few times on a few things. Not often that he does it, But I think part of the problem is, like Angelo was talking about Trump being in the Fox bubble. I think to a certain extent, McConnell is in the Republican bubble. He's in the corporate interest bubble, the moneyed people bubble, the Chamber of Commerce bubble. And I don't think he really pays that much attention. As long as he can get money to Kentucky and keep getting reelected, he doesn't really have to consider other points of view. And one of the ways he gets that kind of money is by getting the Chamber of Commerce behind him, getting the Koch brothers behind him, getting as much money as he can, and spreading that money out to his caucus.
Right. It seems like what Republicans are actually running up against now is the realization that if your views are only popular with a third of the population, eventually that becomes a stumbling block, no matter how much money or special interest groups you have in your pocket. Eventually the Supreme Court is no longer legitimate when it only espouses the views of a third of the country, if that.
But if it can keep upholding voter suppression, then it's the whole ballgame. If you can keep suppressing the vote of at least a third of the other 2/3, then you're still in the fight. And that's what's happening right now.
So, Kerry, we have about 4 minutes left. Are there any other reader questions that we may want to
I have one here that isn't exactly on topic, but it's worth a shot. Jay from Facebook says, what about pending lawsuits that Trump will have to deal with? I mean, I just find this delicious. There's a lot of lawsuits he's going to have to deal with if he loses. I mean, right? I'm just going to fingers crossed and just, say a little prayer. But I mean, does anyone want to weigh in? Like, he's no longer going to have at his disposal the Justice Department to intervene, or at least try to intervene in every one of these lawsuits. So I know I've written on some of them. He's got a defamation lawsuit that was recently in the news, and the Justice Department was just rejected by a federal court from intervening in that. There's the Manhattan DA is at this point very close to getting his tax returns. There's one final Hail Mary at the Supreme Court. I'm cautiously optimistic that the first time I hit the Supreme Court, it was rejected by that Supreme Court with 7 votes. So, I'm cautiously optimistic that at some point, either the Attorney General of New York or the Manhattan DA is going to get their hands on the taxes, and they've already got bank records from Deutsche Bank. So I think that if Trump loses, he's going to end up spending, many, many years in litigation just.
He has that $400 million loan coming due, and who knows how he's going to spend it. So we're pretty much out of time. But Joan, we have enough time for you to tell us how much will you celebrate when Trump is dragged before grand juries and depositions.
I think he's going to be in a dacha in Russia. So
Oh, there's a prediction.
He
did say the other day, he was like, I may have to leave the country, and I was like,
he's thinking he's going to have to. I mean, he's not going to be able to find any lawyers ever again. Giuliani's not going to help him.
There's always some sucker who thinks that they're the ones that are going to be different. Joan, McCarter, Daily Kos, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure. And Kerry, it's a week away. Everybody, go to dailykos.com/GOTV. GOTV stands for.
We had someone ask about what you can do. You can still give money in some of these races. It will still make a difference. But you can also go to dailykos.com/GOTV, and there's lots of opportunities there still to tweet people.
Including calling Texas. You can pick Texas if you want to try to win the Senate race and the president. Texas, if Pennsylvania is the state that freaks you out, Pennsylvania. There's a link to phone banking in Pennsylvania. There's lots of ways you can still be involved. We have a week left. You got to leave it all on the road. I don't think we're going to lose the president's race, but we need to win it big to avoid the chaos that Trump wants to sow. We also need to get that Senate from what on a good night would be maybe 50-50 or 51-49 Democratic advantage to 55, 56 seats. And just imagine how amazing it would be on election night. We come away winning the South Carolina Senate race, and there's no more Lindsey Graham to have to deal with. There's so much at stake in this ballot. dailykos.com/GOTV. Any last thoughts, Kerry?
No, that's it. I'm pumped. I hope everybody gets out and does everything they can in this last week. I'm taking on 2 phone banking shifts this week beyond my one. So do what you can and get your family to the polls.
So I'm Markos Moulitsas. Kerry Eleveld, thank you for joining us for this week's The Brief. Please subscribe to the Daily Kos channel on YouTube, and we'll see you again next week on Election Day at 1:30 Pacific, 4:30 Eastern. This is Daily Kos' The Brief. Thank you very much. Fight hard all this week.